Okay, well, good morning to everyone. This is Jason Thornton, and this is the post-sermon conversation with Memorial Drive Church of Christ. And yesterday, we got to hear from Connor Bryant. And Connor is a good friend of mine. I'm not name dropping. He really likes me. And no, but Connor, you did an outstanding job. It was about, we were doing Advent, working through Advent, and working through sounds wrong. We're absorbing Advent and the concepts of Jesus coming.
Mhm.
And we talked about peace the first week, and you focused in on hope. And I just love it.
Reverse.
What's that? You focused in
Reverse
on
that.
peace. There we go. There we go. I didn't even listen to your sermon at all. I am totally clueless. Anyway, so yes,
So your
that's
name
right.
is Connor, right? Your name is Connor, right?
Can we start again? Anyway, the I love leaving my mess ups on recordings. So if anybody says, "Man, are you better than me?" I'm like, "Yeah, no." Um, that dynamic of trying to take a concept we've talked about over and over and over again, and in this case, hope is not yours, but peace was yours. And say, okay, how do we see this with fresh eyes? Because clearly this is a main concept of connecting with Christ and being in relationship with God, is this idea of peace. And I just thought you did a fantastic job of getting us to see it through a new lens, and specifically, and the timing was obviously just beautiful. And I'll let you dig into that a little bit. But just the corollary, the parallel lines that are experiencing are the experiences you're having, but also the experiences that Mary and Joseph would have had. So anyway, so just in
Yeah.
general, how did it feel like approaching that sermon, delivering the sermon? What sticks out to you?
Sure. So I really appreciate that. I think it is really interesting, right? When you asked me to do it, and as I began to kind of prepare for it and think through it, there was just this obvious, corollary, right, with my daughter being possibly born. Her due date is on December 25th, and so there was this, like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience before when you're like preparing a sermon where you're like, well, I can't not use that. Like, that can't not factor in that. Part of it's like, well, it's just too good, but then also part of it's like that's so obviously God's timing in all of it. I felt really good about it. Peace is one of those things that you can just go 1,000 different directions, and even with the text Isaiah 9:6, there's so many different jumping off points and so many different places you can take it. And so it was one of those things that, like, one of the things I love when this happens in Scripture, when you get to teach on it, is when you just feel completely and utterly free. And I hope that kind of comes through when I talk about Jesus. A lot of times there's this restrictive feeling that people get when they start to study the Bible or hear somebody speak on it. But just with this text, just like separating this text only and the concept of peace and shalom, there is just so many different ways to go. And so for me, it was like I was getting to play in all different like all the different pools I want to play in at at a at a water park, I guess. Although that sounds terrible in COVID times, a water park.
I'll edit that out. I have no idea how to do that. So you're stuck with it. No, that's good. I like that, because on one hand, you have a very specific focus, that is the
Mm-hmm.
peace that Christ brings. But on the other hand, it's like anything about God. It is so multifaceted. It is so
Yeah.
profound. And what I love too is the listener. If we had 100 listeners report back that had really listened and said, "Here's what Connor said," you would have 100 different versions. They may even all fixate on one main point you made, but when you drill down and says, what does that mean to you? How does that affect your life? It would all be different. And
Yeah.
it's just the majestic nature of even something as relatively simple as studying a concept about God.
Sure. And I think that gets to something we're always really passionate about, is existing in the moment that God has placed you in, right? Because, like, if you were to put me back a year ago or even a year from now, I can guarantee you I would preach a different sermon. If I were to hear what I said a week or two from now, or even, past my child's birth, it's going to come off completely differently. And one of the things I really not struggled with, but wrestled with when I was preparing, is there's a lot of scholarly debate on who the child is referencing in Isaiah 9:6. there's like two kind of sides, and I take the third way, like most times in scripture, of is Isaiah referring to Hezekiah, or is it this prophecy of Jesus? And for me, the answer was both. Yes, yes, and as so often I think scripture is. But in that, like there's this, and I don't really want to get into it because I'm not near smart enough. But there's so many times throughout the Old Testament, especially, where there are these prophecies that you can point to being fulfilled in certain people and in Jesus. And for me, it's this really cool dynamic at play, like that God is constantly where he can bring so many different meanings and so many different just really cool things from multiple different places at different times throughout history. And that's just one of the things that gets me really jazzed about Jesus and all that fun stuff.
Well, yeah, and even so, that's a really fascinating thing because the dual nature of prophecy is well known. But we do that too with scripture. We're like, who does whatever First Peter 1:7 apply to? I don't
Yeah.
know even what that says off the top of my head. It applies to the people then and to the people now, and I think
Yeah.
there's just interesting, and there's some precision in prophecy, and I get that, but it is that concept that's fascinating. The other thing that jumps out at me about the Isaiah passage is how when I read the Isaiah passage, just for me, the Isaiah 9 passage, I really hone in on the wonderful counselor dynamic
Mm.
because that's what I need. Most of the time I feel like, oh, I'm so messed up in my thinking. Christ, I need your counsel. I need your guidance, but the person, and this is the point you made when you talk about what will you tell your daughter Indigo about 2020 when she's 10, 12, whatever years old, and what were Joseph and Mary going to tell Jesus about the year he was born and the chaos he was built into, and because he wouldn't have any memory of living in Egypt. It's funny, my parents moved to Rhode Island when I was 2 and we lived there 6 months. I have no memory of Rhode Island. But if anybody ever asked me about it, I'm like, hey, I lived in Rhode Island. Was Jesus going around? Because their culture was not mobile at all. He was like,
Yeah.
I lived in Egypt for a bit. You know what I mean? Would he brag and dropping that?
So like if he was in modern days, he would have like world traveler in his bio on Instagram.
Exactly right. You have no idea how great I am. Yeah, there's the Son of God thing, but I lived in Egypt. So which would have been a big deal for a Jew, to go down and survive, in that culture. And obviously, a king tried to kill me, and he killed a bunch of other kids that were my same demographic trying to kill me.
Okay, you just said that, and I think sometime we should play a game of like, the game. Obviously, I don't. There's a question of could Jesus play the game of two truths and a lie? Like, could he tell a lie as part of a game? But besides that, I think what would be like his top two stories to try to get like a stranger to stumble on him? Like like as a baby, there was a death warrant on my life. I think that would be like the number one. Like, no, that can't be true.
We need to do a whole on Amazed and Perplexed. That's a podcast we have if you're not aware, listener. But we need to do a whole thing on that dynamic, on the craziness of the Bible if you present it out of context. Mm-hmm. So back to your message about peace. I love the dynamic though of considering. I mean, it really resonated with me how the birthing process itself isn't peaceful. Mm-hmm. In that sense, in the sense of the circumstances all feel good, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's even if beyond the pain of labor, it's just there's a lot of anxiety. I mean, I've spent not many, but I've had multiple times being in a birthing room with an enormous amount of anxiety about whether my child will live through the process, about how is it going to go, and I think especially first time parents. You have everybody's stories, but it's your story you're going to go to, so It's just, there's a lot of anxiety, but then outside of that, the dynamic of the world around you, because even now we think, I know you've thought about what kind of world are we bringing Indigo into, mm-hmm. and what is her future and her hope. And of course they would have had some thoughts along those lines. And I thought you did a really good job. Can you talk a little bit more about that dynamic of it's almost the tension between here's this beautiful, miraculous, peaceful experience, if you look at it from the right perspective, and yet the
Yeah.
human experience would be totally different.
So I think you said something just a second ago that makes me think back to even when we were deciding to start trying to have kids, there was a really big tension for Hannah and I, my wife, of whether, because it was a pandemic, because all these things were happening, like should we put these plans on hold? Should we stop? And part of our story it is that we didn't, and God kind of came through like miraculously quickly to for Hannah to be pregnant and for our daughter to be in existence. And so I think this overall thing, right? I think you and I talk about this so often, Jason, of if God can't be my God in the worst pain that I've ever experienced in my life, but he can be my God when things are really good, then ultimately what use is he to me, right? Like if Jesus is only going to show up in my life when when everything is great, or even to the other side, if Jesus is only going to be a part of my life when everything is really terrible, I'm missing. I mean, we've all had friends like that, or people in our lives who one extreme or the other would just vacillate and run away or run towards us, just depending on how they would feel. And I think so often we have that tendency with God, just kind of based on personality lines. And when it comes to something like childbirth, and it comes to something like your dreams coming true, or even possibly your nightmares coming true, there has to be this recognition, or it doesn't have to be, but I feel like it's there's a healthy recognition that if God is God of everything, then I can safely acknowledge the pain and the struggle in a situation, and God is not afraid of that acknowledgement. And because he's not afraid of that acknowledgement, because he's big enough for that acknowledgement, I can firmly grasp to the other side and say, yes, he is good. And there is peace, there is hope, and there is joy in the situation. So I don't know if that directly answered your question, but
Yeah. I think so. I think so much of this is perspective. And I think we acknowledge that God is eternal and God has no limitations, but then we think of him as equally limited to us. And it's almost like if you thought spatially, imagine you have this huge, it's just a floor, it's a white floor, and it just stretches on. No, it's about this big. It's only the space you can stand in. Let's start there with this imaginary illustration. So you're on this white, it's just a square, it's a tile, and you spill something, and it covers everything, and it's nasty whatever you spilled, and it's going to be hard to clean up, and you're just really desperate because when you spill something, you think about when you break glass, you always want to step outside the glass. It's the same kind of thing. You spill something, you know, step outside, but it just covers everything that you have. It's in all your space, so you can't get to a clean space to work. And then all of a sudden, if God were to flip a switch and you were to see things from his perspective, it would stretch on forever. And now you got this really teeny tiny space you have to clean up, and this huge space that is totally clean. And I don't know if that's communicating well, because I'm just thinking out loud here, but that's how my life is. When I've had horrible trauma in my life, it consumed everything. It colored everything. Like you and I have talked a lot about our first child and how she was in, a NICU for 2 months. That absorbed everything. I didn't have a single thought that didn't include my daughter's in intensive care. She may not live. You know what I mean? There was nothing beyond that. Now at that same time, God is dealing with my life, just one life. He's dealing with the whole of my existence. He's seeing when I'm, 0 years old to 100 years old, however long I live. He sees my eternity even, and so he's thinking so broad. And then you add billions and billions of people, and he's thinking so broad. Now, having said that, he doesn't come to me and say, "You're so dumb, your mess doesn't matter." He's saying, when you get my perspective, I can take care of this. This is a thing that is isolated. So he's gentle with me and kind, and not rushing me to not grieve, or not being condescending, but simultaneously his perspective is so much bigger. And that's what I thought about. If I'm sitting with Mary and Joseph, I am freaking out. And when we celebrate after he's born, these shepherds show up. but that'd be freaky. I mean, to have these strange shepherds, like nobody wants shepherds showing up at the party. It's like, what are you doing there? And then
Oh,
they're
that's
saying
good.
these great things. It'd be so freaky. Like the whole thing would be just, but of course they're so displaced and disoriented that of course shepherds are showing up. Of
Sure.
course, they move into a house later and these wise men show up. Of course they do. Of course they give us
Mhm.
more money than we'll ever have in our life. And I think that's the dynamic that is so hard, because in that moment, all they could see is we got to deliver this child, and yikes,
Yeah.
and God's saying, wait, you don't see this bigger picture.
So I love that, like this idea of when things start really rolling, you just have this mindset, well, like, of course that's what's going to happen. This crazy thing is going to come. And I think birth is like a cool encapsulation of that, especially the stories I hear from fathers. And I'm not going to get too graphic, but fathers will talk about their experiences and the crazy things that happen in delivery rooms. And it's just like, you don't have a choice to, like, you either have the choice of like, I'm going to pass out, I'm going to wimp out and get out of there, not to be
Right.
judgmental of anybody, because who knows, maybe I'm a wimp and I'll fail in that regard. I hope not. But there is this reality of, like, I'm not going to be able to stop in the moment, like during when Hannah's like giving birth, and be like, okay, I'm just going to meditate right now. I'm just going to, like, I'm going to have a 20-minute prayer real quick. Like that's not reality. I have to rely on God, like in singular moments, that he is going to come through and he's going to provide. And yeah, I love that aspect of God as this over, like his ability, like trusting in his ability to have the overarching picture in mind, gives me the comfort and the peace to live in the millisecond that I'm living in. And that, man, that you just saying that, kind of like what you said, kind of gives me maybe some tools that I'll use here, and whoever knows how long until Indigo's born.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. And you had mentioned earlier this dynamic of living in the now. Living in the now. Back to my little, I'll have to refine my illustration, whatever, but back to that little thing. If I'm in that mess, because I've been in spots where I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't figure this out. And I've got to figure this out. And if I keep panicking, it may not get worse, but I feel worse about it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But if I take a breath and say, wait, right now I have a God I can trust. Right now I have a God that will get me through this. And I struggled with panic. I struggle with panic attacks, and that's been one of my tools. Is to say, look, I can't tell what 5 minutes is going to be like, but I can say right now, God's got me. And I think that just this is the nature of prayer without ceasing. It's not I'm always on my knees and not functioning in other facets of life. It's that I'm constantly aware this is a journey that God, through his spirit, is on with me every single moment. And the spirit isn't the problem. I'm the problem, because I shut him off to do my work. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute. So I think that's excellent for all of us. I wanted to point out, and you brought up, and I thought I've never thought about this in correlation, but the idea of Pax Romana. Talk to us a little bit about that, just in case somebody didn't see the sermon. But the contrast between Pax Romana and the experience the Jews were having.
Sure. So for me, this was like such a, when you mentioned peace, when you talked about me doing the peace sermon in Advent, you sent me the thing. There was just one of those God things that just clicked in my mind. I was like, why hadn't I ever thought of this before? And it seems like such an obvious correlator. So the Pax Romana is this, it's this concept, this idea that historians have, that the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, they'd expanded, they'd conquered all their neighbors basically, and they'd done such a good job of conquering that they could stop doing conquering for a little while. And so there was no major large scale battles or anything like that. And so I don't know, and I didn't do enough reading. I did quite a bit of reading on the Pax Romana, but I don't think that was like their official term during the day. But it was certainly something that the Romans were like very proud of, like the fact that they had basically brought peace and prosperity to their new empire. If you're a Star Wars Revenge of the Sith fan, this was something that they were like super excited about. And I think about how often people or states that are, or power, people that are in power over others, they have a lot of times they have this, they don't have an accurate picture of what's happening. And I think this is something that's so there's so many parallels that we can find throughout history. The idea that this thing to hold up as glorious and amazing for the Roman state is in fact this man. It's the decimation of a way of life, specifically for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people who so much of their identity was wrapped up in being God's people, God's chosen country, and the Romans had come in, and basically that was being constantly, day after day, putting on trial. Basically, constant. It was a constant, glaring reminder for them that they had failed in the eyes of God and that they were actively messing up. Otherwise, in their theology, in their mind, they wouldn't be where they're at. And so this would have just been something that constantly on their mind. And I talk about it in the sermon a lot, how this is something that keeps coming up throughout the Gospels. And so it just became this, like, if I was a person, I'm lucky to live where I live and lucky to be who I am. But if I was living under active oppression, if somebody came in and told me, no, you're actually not, you're living in peace and prosperity, it would be such a insult to me that, man, I don't even know if I could be able to like function when somebody brought that up around me.
Man, I'll tell you, when I first heard Pax Romana or Pax Romana,
I'll tell you a funny thing about the pronunciation later at the end.
Yeah. Can I tell you something that's just ridiculous? I was in a class one time. I was about 19. I was in the Army, and I was in a teen class because they had no other class, like nobody my age. And the teacher of the class and a 13-year-old got into a lengthy argument about whether it was Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar. And it dominated the entire class, like tears were shed. So anytime somebody pronounces something different, I'm like, don't bring it up. Don't bring it up. Just pronounce it like they do. Anyway, but when you talk, I was taught about that as Pax Romana was a such a benefit, because the question always is, why did Jesus come then? Why did God send Jesus at exactly that time? And Pax Romana is one of the reasons that people point to, is because it gave Paul and other people access to a whole new world. Prior to Pax Romana, you didn't have access to that. It was a much different kind of access. Now, I don't know if that reasoning is true or valid. God will do what God wants to do. But it's interesting. I had never thought of the insult of it, of how insulting it would be for you to not have fundamental rights. You talk about oppression. I mean, and the irony of this one, and it's not like slavery would be superior to that. Don't misunderstand. But they were to function as free people. They still had a government, but it was all puppet. So it was a different kind of insult. You still have your land, you still have your temple, but everything was constantly oppressive. They didn't have their own rights. And I think any kind of oppression like that, and then to say, and this is where this gets convicting for me, any kind of oppression you have, the dominant culture feels like these are the good old days.
Yeah.
While they don't realize, the dominant culture doesn't realize that it's the good old days because you keep paying your taxes that are not just. Because if you sought equal freedom to them, it would upset their system. And then I asked myself, as part of the dominant culture, and I believe we should not worship cultural equality. I believe we should not worship anything but God himself. But I also believe that as a God worshiper, and specifically with the mandate to love everybody, we have to keep opening our eyes to our own bias. And I think of a lot of people where they talk, even Trump's, and this is not a political statement, but the Make America Great Again dynamic, it rang with so many people. Let's restore the good old days of America, which were very good for a lot of people. You know what I mean? But it was very bad for a lot of people. And functionally, what they were saying is we should restore Pax Romana, where the dominant culture felt a certain hopefulness for the future because of these dynamics. And I don't mean that to be political. I'm just talking personally. I need to receive that message to put it in the appropriate context, that if I'm a Roman citizen, am I sensitive to the fact that not just the Jews, but a lot of cultures live in, regardless of what their freedom looks like, they're under subjugation. And it's this constant lie. And then what do I do as a Roman citizen to show true love to a Jewish person when they don't have the privilege I have? Now, America is not set up like Rome. There's so many differences. So I don't mean to suggest that, you know what I mean? But I'm just talking about the general principle of this idea of when I say, hey, everything's great, and another person says, no, this is very troubling, I need to pause and listen and recognize I may have a very different perspective than the person that I'm hearing from. But my tendency will be, no, don't you see this is the good old days? I'll want to defend my Pax Romana, if you will. And I'm probably using that out of context, but
no, I think one of the things that is so beautiful and convicting, we, 60 years after, the civil rights movement, we'll listen and we'll read from MLK and from people who are leading that movement, and you'll hear these beautiful sermons and these amazing orators, and they will profess this desire for being treated as human beings and being treated as equals, and so many of them do it through the lens of the gospel. And for us, 60 years later, it comes off as so remarkable and beautiful and compelling. And I think about how, man, just compelling this is, that lens is for me, because it's compelling. It's a good reminder that if I was coming of age in the 60s, if I was 50, 60 years old in the 60s, I would not have seen probably MLK in the light that I get to see him now. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing for Jesus. And I think about even somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., who was born into oppression and born into an unfair system. Jesus was born into an unfair system as well. He was born into oppression, and yet God can use that to just to spread his message. And for me, that is such a the things that get me really excited about Jesus and telling people about Jesus, like this is the kind of stuff that I'm like, let's get out there, because this is just the stuff that makes my heart thrum in that same heartbeat of God.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I love that. And I love because I've heard, as I've grown up in the American culture and spent a decent amount of time in the Bible Belt, we will point to, well, what would the good old days look like? Well, if we had prayer in school, and if we, if abortion was illegal, and if, or at least states got to decide, or these kind of things. And I'm not, it's not me knocking these things. What I think, though, that quickly becomes is, if my life circumstance, if the cultural circumstances, if the global circumstances would just line up, then we could be at peace. And that's the opposite of shalom.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why Jesus was born into oppression and why he was born so poor is that if we will look at him honestly, we will say, I have no excuse not to be peaceful. I have no excuse not to be hopeful, not to be joyful. I have no excuse not to feel purposeful, because I say, and I'm not talking about somebody else, I say, well, look at the world. What am I going to be able to do? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have privilege out the window. I mean, it's just amazing what I can do as a human being living today. You know what I mean? And I just think we put this self-limitation on us, and we nostalgize, if that's a word, what happened back then. Oh, those were the good old days.
Yeah. And I think what I love about that concept is Jesus, when he came into the interaction with the Pharisees, who very much had that, hey, let's get back to, when things were really good, let's get back to that. There was this open condemnation and this, hey, turn away. But when Jesus came into contact with the poorest of the poor, the people who were being most, who felt the Roman oppression the most, who felt their standing in society, their standing in society the least, they felt it the most. Jesus didn't wield that reality with a club, right? Jesus Jesus didn't say, well, yeah, you haven't eaten. Yeah, all your land has been taxed away. And, you can't worship the way you want, because not just the Roman government is against you, but now the Pharisees and, the Sanhedrin, they're against you too. And they're making it more expensive for you to offer your yearly sacrifice. Jesus could, in theory, wield it as a club and say, and you still should be peaceful, and you're not peaceful, and you're a bad person for it. But Jesus comes to these people who are being oppressed, and he says, all those feelings you're having are fair, and they're not fake. They're real. And I still want to offer you shalom. I still want to offer you peace. And I want to be, not only do I want to offer you that, not only do I want to be your shalom, do I want to be your peace, I want to help you be peacemakers. I want to help you be shalom bringers. And man, that's just so cool to me.
That is. And that brings up that whole dynamic of, I got this cool opportunity. There's an AIM student who's a missionary now in Estonia. And she's recording short videos on Facebook to put out to friends, that are doing that, but they speak English. I don't understand the dynamics. So I'm recording a few. But one of the questions that she gave me is, what is it you like about Jesus? And one of the things I really honed in on, just that really touched me, even hearing that question, was, you would be stunned at how for you he is. Jesus would be for you. That doesn't mean he doesn't need the spotlight. He wouldn't, if he walked into a room, he wouldn't be, hey, everybody look at me. Most of Jesus' interactions were because other people came to him. Even his first miracle, he's just sitting at a wedding party and somebody's like, create wine. But 90% of his interactions are because people came to him and he responded to them. He wasn't like, hey, I'm here, everybody, life of the party, And
line up here for your miracle.
Right. And then
single file line, everybody.
That's right. And then you would find out, if you are open to him, how for you he is. Now he's for everybody, but you would feel it if you were open to it. But then the next thing he would do, and this is the part I left out, was that idea of, he would then open your eyes to how to be for you to everybody else, how you can be for them, just like Jesus, trusting that Jesus is for them in the same way he's for you. And I think this idea of everything Jesus did, we have a manifestation of that. Now, a lot of times we'll jump to, but I can't do these miracles. And I'm like, Jesus wasn't obsessed with his miracles. He was obsessed with loving and honoring God, and that expression to the people around. And that's the thing we can do. And to assume, well, if I had miraculous power, this would go so much better, is honoring the wrong thing.
Yeah.
If God gives you miraculous power, go ahead, miracle it up, But that idea of, that's still not the main point. It's drawing honor to God by loving him and loving the person in front of you. And that's what Jesus did. And even in his birth, which, God arranged, so he was part of that, however that works. But even in his birth, there is this loving signal to the world that I didn't come to club you. You know what I mean? Because I could have made him a king or a dominator. He could have come full grown. He could have been, whatever, the most muscular,
he could have been
powerful ruler.
He could have been the prince that, I think in my sermon I talked about, he could have been I wanted to draw on this. He could have been the prince that comes with the sword, and instead he comes as the Prince of Peace. That's
right. Yeah, absolutely. That brings up, and for our last kind of question, what is there anything you left out that if you had 5 more minutes, you'd be like, oh, I really want to talk about this?
Well, I touched a little bit on the Hezekiah dynamic, but I'm not smart enough to go line by line in detail and talk about it. I think there was an interesting thing that during the recording process that happened. So when I first went to record it, halfway through, I didn't know this, I did the whole thing and my phone died halfway through it, and so I had to be up for work like 3 to 4 hours later. I go to work really early in the morning, and so it was like incredibly soul crushing for me. And when I recorded it, when I did the sermon, I was probably not actually in the best headspace, and there's a cool story about that too. But I recorded it and I was like, I've got it. It's fantastic. I went and showed my wife, Hannah, and she goes, huh, I always thought it was the Pax Romana, when I started talking about the Pax Romana, and I was like, wait a second, it is the Pax Romana. I took 3 years of Latin in high school, and I realized that when I listened to books on the Pax Romana leading up to the sermon, I listened to a couple books. They were read by British people, and the British people, I had them speaking at 2 times speed, and so for them it was sounded very blurred, and I had this like, well, I got to go redo the whole sermon because like I couldn't like physically like alter my voice to have the correct pronunciation, and I agonized for like a good 5 to 10 minutes about, do I need to re-record it, what do I do? And my wife the whole time, just the voice of reason, was like, no, you don't need to re-record the whole thing, nobody's going to notice, nobody, whatever. And I loved it for me because it was this check, because I'm sure you have the same sort of thing when you preach. You want to be seen as good. You want to be seen as like you did a good job and you were competent. You knew exactly everything you were talking about. And for me, it was this active challenge that I knew for the several days leading up to the sermon. I was like, I got that one thing wrong in there, and it was so hard for me not to go back and correct it. And it was so humbling for me, and that didn't really wasn't like a, you know, content wise, but I thought that was an interesting growth thing that God was able to work on my heart, just, you know, on the preparation side of things.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That is. That's why I messed up this earlier in this recording.
You
So
trusted me.
I no. I mean, I said when I said you had hope instead of peace, I meant to do that. I've been agonizing over. Do I just cut the first 10 minutes and
Yeah.
that kind of thing? So good. No, that is good. And I'll tell you, that really connects in with preaching. For most preachers I know, we carry this same burden of. I was just talking to a guy a couple of days ago where he just was fine tuning the sermon and fine tuning the sermon, and it just hit him that he was worshiping the sermon
Mm-hmm.
or worshiping himself or trying to bring glory to himself. I think was his words, by just like perfectionistic, oh, how's this going to sound? Oh, wait a minute. What about these group of people that's going to listen to it? What about, and it was
Yeah.
just way too controlling. And he really,
Mm-hmm.
he forced himself to release. And here's what's interesting. He was going to do it in front of a big audience. And then they told him, hey, we're closing everything down. You're going to do it on a video. So now you're going to be in a room with no one, and
Yeah.
you'll have no feedback. And of course, we know what that feels like. But it was so like a message from God to him. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
took it in the right way. He was like, here I am fine tuning. And certainly those same people would hear it. But it's such a different experience when you're eye to eye with people when you're speaking. And so he saw that as, I think it is, a good journey with him and God to refine that process. And I think all of us, if we're after God in any way, preachers and non-preachers, I will get that from him,
For
where it'll
sure.
show up.
For sure. And I
Well,
think that's
very
one of the
good.
cool things. This doesn't really have anything to do with anything, but I think it's one of the cool things, one of the cool, interesting battles about where we find the church finds itself in 2020 with all the closures and reopenings and the closures, is when you go to preach a sermon. I know there's some people out there that are, manuscripting every single word and memorize it. And I've done that a few times before, but practically speaking, it's just that's just really that's, kudos to you if you do that. But if you mess up in a sermon, if you misspeak or you go down a way that you don't want to go, you can't back up and re-record. You can't, if it's really bad, you can say, hey, let's just forget the last, 20 seconds. But for the most part, you just kind of have to keep going. You don't have a choice but to like, I'm going to go back and make yourself sound perfect. Even if you go back and say, let's forget about it, like there's still the reality that everybody knows you messed up. And when you're sitting and recording your own message, and there's no audience, there's no live feedback, you have to constantly battle that, like, battle that desire to get it absolutely perfect. And it's almost a blessing that when we do it live, quote unquote, that's not an option, because I don't think, before we started doing our podcast, I didn't realize how obsessed I was with making myself sound more intelligent than I probably actually am.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like, you don't know until you know,
Mm-hmm.
like my friend, he didn't know he was trying to bring glory to himself. He didn't sit out and say, how do I bring glory to myself? He really wanted to bring glory to God. but he noticed in the preparation, he didn't feel peace. He just felt increasingly agitated and increasingly pressured. And to his credit, he stepped back and was like, wait a minute, what's happening here? You know, and it was just a beautiful thing because he had made that decision initially to release it. And it's not anti-preparation, it's just your focus, you know. And then, like, I don't know, a day, 2 days later, he gets the news that he's not going to have his shining moment with all these people watching him. He's going to be speaking into a screen. And what's interesting too, there were a few people that ended up coming and hearing the sermon, like live, I think family members, and it was beautiful. Like, it took on a whole new dynamic of experience than he imagined. And he just sees it. I mean, it's one of those things that we wouldn't call that a miracle. You're calling it COVID closure a miracle? How? That's like blasphemy almost. But man, that's how God shows up in our life if we keep watching him. And the key here is that's because of his mistake, not in spite of his mistake. Had he not made the mistake of unintentionally seeking glory for himself initially, we wouldn't have this story of how beautiful it is. And this is the dynamic. God doesn't need you to make mistakes, but he's not afraid of them at all. And I just wonder if we were there, you talk about unsolicited advice. I wonder if you and I were there as, I'm going to go ahead and put you in my boat, you know, as far as we don't know the inner workings of pregnancy, you know, we've seen TV, but we've never delivered a baby. Let's put it that way, you know? But even with our 2020 mindset, I bet you we would know things they wouldn't know. And can you imagine if we were there at the birth and we couldn't affect it, but we could critique it? We're like, oh, Mary, you should, oh, no, don't, Joseph, oh, please stop. Why are the animals in here? Why are the animals in here? You know? And so anyway, I just think that's always a funny thing. We're like, the cattle are lowing. I mean, that is gross. Get the cattle out. Get the cattle
Yeah, that
out.
would certainly not have been something that Mary was singing about, singing happily about.
She didn't write that song, guaranteed. So
yes.
Anyway, well, thank you so much, man. Just very grateful for you, your life, your ministry, and prayers for you and Hannah and Indigo. And that this will be, in addition to you finding peace in the middle of it all, but that it really will be, in perspective, a very peaceful process for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you later.
See you.